Thank you all for coming tonight for this fireside chat with Jamie Beaton, our own Jamie Beaton, like the man, one of the key persons behind the growth of Crimson. And we'll definitely discuss his whole story. So Jamie, why don't we start with your journey towards the MBA? You were sitting at Harvard, you were doing extremely well in your academic tenure. I think you graduated 2 years earlier than your peers with a master's in applied mathematics. So why don't we start with what's behind Crimson? Why did you even want it to start Crimson?
Absolutely. So growing up in New Zealand, most students would be thinking about local New Zealand or Australian universities. And my aspiration was initially to do medicine, probably at the University of Auckland. When I was 13, I actually sat on the train on the way to my high school, and I sat next to a boy called Ben Kornfeld who got into Yale. And he told me that I should think about applying to these global schools. So I spent the next 4 years really quite obsessively focusing on building a really strong profile across academics, extracurriculars, leadership, essays, interviews. I always loved academics, but I saw this pathway of going to America as an opportunity to really catalyze my, ambitions in various areas. So I went on this journey, applied to a lot of US schools like Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Wharton, Princeton, Columbia and stuff, got into all the various schools. And then I launched Crimson initially to guide students to these top institutions. Now, as I went through Harvard, I'd begun building Crimson and I was getting to some good scale, helping, students with their undergraduate admissions journey. But it dawned on me that to really build Crimson into the global education company I aspired to build, I wanted to level up as a founder, as a leader. And I thought an MBA would be probably one of the most efficient ways to do this, because I would really want to use the learnings to make sure I had a well-rounded skill set across marketing, strategy, finance, ethics, and beyond. So we'll touch more on that soon. But basically, what inspired me to start Crimson was really this idea that, getting into these schools is transformative, but it's super confusing, complicated. There's a lot of strategy. And I felt very lucky about how I managed to get through it. And I wanted to bring to students around the world that systematic intensity that, we love at Crimson.
So you mentioned you wanted to scale and you really thought the MBA was maybe the best way to go. So why don't we deep dive a bit more on this one and explain us your reasoning behind why building Crimson? You could have allocated fund maybe more towards Crimson. What was the turning point for you to know okay, I need to get my MBA done? Was it the fact that long term you knew you were going to scale it to 1,000 plus people and you wanted to develop your leadership skill? What was the rationale back then?
Yeah. So when I was 21, we had about 50 full-time staff and I was a student in college. And I thought, I can really, if I have the right resources, the right training, I can make this thing massive around the world. And, really, in order to do that, I as a leader need to level up. Leadership didn't really come naturally to me in high school. And I thought, I picked up some skills by just practically building a company a little bit. But people think that, you can just do entrepreneurship by just turning up and learning. But actually, just like anything else, if you just turn up to a physics exam, you're going to get smoked. And in business, people have been practicing the craft of business for generations. And so I think it's kind of arrogant to think that you can just roll in and pick everything up. So I thought these top business school programs could give me really detailed training in sales, marketing, product strategy, leadership, HR, all these different skill sets. And I don't like to feel like I'm doing something and I'm trying, I'm sort of winging it. I like to feel like I've actually rigorously understood all the key things I need. So then when I'm executing, I have sort of the strongest hand in what I'm doing. So for me, it was about long-term preparation to be a good CEO for the business. I also saw it as an opportunity to recruit talented classmates. One of my talented leaders here at Crimson, Ed Matsuda, I found him in a Stanford MBA classroom in the disruptions in education class. And he joined Crimson and has been a formidable leader, building our Japanese practice to be the largest of its kind in the country. Many other folks, for example, one of my classmates, Owen, his hedge fund became a substantial investor in Crimson. There's a guy on our board who works for a hedge fund in the West Coast, Altimeter Capital, who I met through Business School Network. So I really saw, because I was trying to build a massive company, global scale, and I was a young guy with limited experience, this was going to be the fastest way for me to prepare for that ambition that I had for the future. And that is why I pulled the trigger on my MBA applications.
Weren't you worried a bit that the MBA will distract you from building Crimson at that time?
Totally. And honestly, it's a highly unusual. I probably would say that maybe no one maybe ever has done sort of this funky path I did, where I raised a $30 million Series B round, and then within a year I went to business school. It's very counterintuitive, right? Because basically you raise this round, you're supposed to go guns blazing. But I thought, okay, I'm going to go guns blazing, but I'm going to jump into business school, because I was thinking I'm not just optimizing for 2 years, I'm optimizing for 20 years, 30 years. And so I thought, if I'm not going to do business school now, I'm never going to do it, because basically as I go through, I'm going to perpetually have this bigger and bigger organization, and there's never going to be a better time than doing it right now. And if I do it when I'm early, I can compound those learnings, and it would actually make me a better operator for years to come. So, it was a strategy that only made sense if I had very long-term horizons and very big ambitions. And it was a bad strategy if I had like two-year, thinking. But I thought over the long term, it would make sense. It took a bit of explaining to some of my, passionate investors, but they backed me and backed what we were doing as an organization, and then we went for it.
You were sitting in Harvard, obviously, you don't want to take a step down. Why GSB eventually? And also, I think something people would be curious about, did you consider even other schools than GSB when you were at Harvard?
That's a great question. And I'll be entirely honest with you. So basically, having gone to Harvard undergrad, I felt that, there was really only two schools that, I would go to for my MBA, HBS or GSB. I felt that, going to another school wouldn't make too much sense because the, Harvard undergraduate education is pretty rigorous and well regarded. And so for me, I thought, well, I'm just going to keep building this unless I get into these programs, then I'm going to try to do both simultaneously. So ultimately, I applied for both. And then when I was choosing between them, I ultimately opted for GSB. And, HBS was interesting, but, GSB generally wins in the cross-yield battle. I think approximately for every two kids that go Stanford, one kid goes HBS. So it's about a 70% or so yield rate in the Stanford direction. And I believe Stanford's advantage has compounded in the last decade as things like technology, venture capital, private equity has become more popular. Of course, HBS is incredible. If I didn't have a Harvard degree already, I would go to HBS probably. But given that I had the undergrad degree, I thought, it was a no-brainer to actually jump into what I thought was the best MBA in the world for an entrepreneur, which was a Stanford GSB experience. I also like the fact that there's a really strong focus on international students in GSB. About half the class are international, and the academic trajectory of these kids is very strong. And I felt I could learn a lot from these guys. So ultimately, I chose GSB. I wanted a bit of sunshine, although, I don't usually care about weather. I'm focused on, what gets me the best program.
Great. Thanks, Jamie, for the why GSB. Very insightful. So now, scaling Crimson at GSB, right? So you mentioned earlier, you raised a 30 million Series B. Then you told your investor, hey, you know what, guys, I'm going to run Crimson from GSB. I'm sure you've got some pushback here and there. But what I would like to hear more about you is at GSB, when you were there, I think the startup garage was celebrating their 5-year anniversary. What kind of resources, programs and experience you leverage at GSB to really, help you scale Crimson to the next level?
Okay, so what I didn't do was things like Startup Garage, where people were kind of trying to design businesses from scratch. Because at this point, I had about 5 million revenue, and our target for revenue that was 15 million. And so I was thinking, I don't need to go in a class and sort of learn about new idea incubation. I've sort of passed that phase. What I need to learn about is I need to find people that have already scaled organizations and figure out what I need to do to take this thing from 5 million, which sounds like a lot, but I consider it sort of a cute starting block to, a really substantial organization. And so in terms of the different classes, I took sales management, which is all about how you scale an organization. It was taught by the founding CEO of Snowflake, which went on to do a $50 billion IPO within 12 months of our graduation, as well as this guy called Kirk Bowman, who was an Excel partner. They explained how some of these amazing companies like Pure Storage had achieved massive growth. So I loved that class. I also took a class called Disruptions in Education, where I was able to learn from many of the top edtech CEOs in the world, like, for example, the CEO of Coursera, the CEO of Degreed, many other great companies that were, at this time, the most popular edtech companies in the world. So they'd come into our class, we could grill them with questions. I could learn about their business model, how it worked, think about Crimson and anything relevant. I also thought classes like strategy were actually very interesting. Some folks go along to, strategy class. I think it's too abstract. But actually, given that I was building my company at this time, everything that I was learning in class was super relevant. And I used to remember I'd leave the class, pick up my phone to Feng Zhou, our co-founder, or one of the team instantly, and literally be like, hey guys, this crazy thing the economist did could actually apply quite nicely to our model. We should think about this. So there are a couple of things. I also love this thing called Executive Challenge, which is in the first year of GSB, where you're in a team of folks and you compete in this competition, which is like a live business sort of negotiation simulation. One's like raising capital, one's like, dealing with a leadership conflict. The other amazing class is called MGE, Managing Growing Enterprises, taught by this guy called Joel Peterson. And he talks about, basically many of the classic challenges you face growing a company. How do you fire someone? How do you hire someone? What do you do if, some terrible thing happens and you've got to have a tough conversation? how do you build sort of corporate values that align to what you want to achieve long term? All these things that are actually very hard to do in practice, but actually very necessary to run a proper company. So I love that class as well.
I think you touched it a little bit, like the focus on entrepreneurship and innovation, like the courses you've taken. But I think like something like GSB is also very famous for and like very recognized for is like their multidisciplinary approach. They have a school of education, like a school of design and all. So have you leveraged any of those resources to also go to the next level with like Crimson?
Of course. I mean, the most natural example is I took what we call the MUMBA program, MA-MBA, which is the Master of Arts in Education and the MBA. At GSB, there are many opportunities to do these great conjoint programs. You can do it with the energy degree. You can do it with engineering, computer science. I did it with education. This was a real win because I spent only 2 years, but I got an education degree and an MBA. And to give you guys some context for how real this was, when I was at the Stanford Education School, I came across the Stanford Online High School and I learned about this business model of online schooling. And I realized, wow, this is pretty cool. And that inspired me to then go and launch a global online high school, which has become a key growth lever for Crimson around the world for our students. So I literally discovered a whole new unit of Crimson by being in the Stanford education degree. And I made some really valuable connections to Stanford professors that have gone on to advise our growth, both in the US and in the online schooling space. So I really credit GSB to our second major division at Crimson, as well as our market entry into America, which is now our biggest market. So pretty exciting stuff. And my professor literally was doing strategy sessions with our, exec team at Crimson shortly after I finished the class. Like it was unreal. And we really got a lot of value out of that. I personally didn't take any design classes, but a lot of my classmates found that very valuable. You got to know your extreme weaknesses, and design for me is just a red, do not go. But, education was fantastic. I took a lot of really relevant classes on things like pedagogy, curriculum design, technology and education, all of which helped me quite a lot as I was growing Crimson.
So you mentioned a couple of schools already, the MG with Joe Peterson, like the sales management, course, like the disruption in education. But let's say you're facing a couple of incoming GSB, starting next year, they want to build their own company. I don't know, maybe one in fintech and one in climate tech, whichever business they're looking at. What kind of advice would you give them, as a heads up before they even start GSB, what they should leverage the most during their time at GSB?
So it's fair to say, and I've done a lot of these different academic programs, GSB has a nearly magical aura of community. People that go to GSB leave like they've left some sort of magical cult of business. And I say this in a really positive way. People are genuinely pumped to be part of this community. So the first thing that I would say is more than any one single class, you really want to invest in that community, because I'm actually next weekend, I got my 5-year reunion for GSB. And, the turnout rate, it's basically everybody. And I went to a reunion recently in Chicago 2 years ago. Again, almost everybody rolls up. People are super engaged in this community. And I think it's because they select people that have already built a lot of great achievements. And, when you combine all these folks, there's so much learning, excitement, and you go through these milestones together. So first thing I'd say is invest in the community, spend time with your classmates. That's where a lot of the magic is. That's the first thing. As far as particular courses, I mentioned a bunch. I also love this class on networks, which is all about two-sided marketplaces. So companies like eBay or companies like, for example, DoorDash and how they've grown, taught by the former chief economist of Google. That was pretty crazy and, gave us some really powerful insights into how these, models are built. I took a class on product launch, which is actually really valuable. Many folks just don't know how to do marketing. And, even though I had some experience already, I found that framework in that class really powerful as well. We also had some really interesting people like a, current Sequoia person from the Sequoia Venture Capital Fund teaching one of our, operations and optimization classes. That was really valuable. But I think my highlight classes would probably be sales management, I think, and strategy. They were my all-time favorites. Also, there was a great class called Entrepreneur Acquisition, which is basically search funds. And, for those of you who are not indoctrinated yet, a search fund is a really popular business model, Harvard and Stanford, where an entrepreneur will go out, will get some finance and will acquire a company. And it's an alternative way to be an entrepreneur. Rather than thinking of a new business, you just buy an existing one and you focus on growing it. And so, one of my close classmates that was in my section actually did this and has been wildly successful doing that. So I think there are a couple of great classes that I'd recommend. I would probably also, emphasize this thing called View from the Top, where you basically hear from these world-leading speakers. So, Jensen Huang from NVIDIA has been going world famous recently for NVIDIA's crazy rise. And, where was he a couple of weeks ago? He was at Stanford giving his View from the Top talk. And then Chamath, who's become a phenomenon in Silicon Valley through the All In podcast, he spoke to our GSB class. Hillary Clinton was there. Like the people coming through are crazy. So definitely, we had Jamie Dimon actually speaking in person. So I really recommend leveraging those experiences because students are the ones asking questions and they don't hold any punches. They ask some pretty ruthless questions, if I don't say so myself, to these people. And it's fun because you learn a lot of good insights from them as well. The last thing I want to touch on is this thing called talk. Talk's very unique to GSB. It's a very GSB-like experience. The way talk works is you basically share some really vulnerable stories about yourself for like 10 minutes or 15 minutes to your classmates. So this could be stories about a military soldier having trauma from, being in active combat in a country. It could be, for example, about, I don't want to give actual examples of things my peers talked about because there's confidentiality, but, pretty hardcore personal experiences that, really would actually make people cry and stuff in the audience. It was pretty serious. But this trust building community of sharing and openness is what fosters that magic in the class, which becomes that powerful alumni network and friend network for many years to come. So there are a couple of things that I would probably recommend. And also while I was, throwing some daggers at Startup Garage, it's actually super useful. DoorDash, which is a massive company, came out of Startup Garage. And if you don't have an idea yet, it's a no-brainer. You should definitely do it. It's a very highly regarded class. People love that class.
Like one of your investors. But maybe if you could spend a bit more time on networking at GSB from your own perspective,
So I think, one reflection is never in my career have I kind of like actively networked where I go out, I sort of meet someone because I'm like, they might be useful in the future. It's not really my style. What I did basically is I took a lot of my classes and, I met people that made great comments in class or, maybe were just seemed funny or, had an interesting background. Maybe they were an international student and I sort of resonated with their story. And people are just so open to sharing. You can go up to anyone in your class, no matter what their background is, and they're usually very open to a discussion. And from there, you can build these deep friendships. So I found that there's just such a circle of trust and connectivity in the class. You can hit up anybody. You can ask classmates to refer you to somebody else. They'll, automatically make connections for you. It really feels like you've got like a group of people that have your back and, cheer you on, back you. They're there for the hard moments and the wins as well. The other thing is the GSB network's very powerful in terms of alumni, obviously beyond your class. So, as for example, this happened to me. This is literally happening right now, actually, where, in the middle of a pretty major investment round at Crimson. And I met a fellow who's a GSBer who's like about 6 years older than me. And immediately the first thing we started talking about for the first 10 minutes of our call was our GSB experience. And he was Australian, I always use Kiwi. And, it was just an instant formative bond. And, let's see how things shake out. But I think they might be a potentially new great partner for us at Crimson. So I think that GSB connection really goes the distance and, really means that you have an instant ability to access any alumni from GSB with an email. People are always keen to help fellow GSB alums. So I think that's really useful for hiring. A lot of people find their husbands and wives at GSB. They find great friends. It's an incredible network.
But you mentioned earlier, for example, when you were doing your master's in education, you've got that idea of the online school, the Crimson Global Academy, right? Do you still have professors from your time at Stanford advising you on this?
Of course. So one of my close mentors that has been a key advisor for the whole time we've been building Crimson Global Academy, Tomohiro. It's been with us the entire time. So that's a good example. Another one, this guy called John DeFigueiredo has been a legendary mentor of Crimson and to me personally also, as I continue to look to grow as a leader. And he's helped us with all kinds of strategy questions. The list goes on of all these fantastic GSBers. And you can always reach out to your professors. They're always super keen to hear from you. And they're really engaged for years to come. So definitely a very powerful resource. And, it doesn't matter kind of how crazy the background is of these people. They usually continue to respond to you and engage with you many years after you graduate, which is part of the magic of the community. So I definitely think that's something that if you're entrepreneurial, if you're sort of not paying attention, right? You don't leverage it, nothing's going to happen. But if you have even an ounce of entrepreneurship, the network will just hit you in your face because it's so omnipotent in your life when you graduate from GSB.
So when you go to GSB, let's say as an aspiring entrepreneur, but you end up going more into the corporate sector, can you maybe, even though it wasn't your case, but I'm sure you had peers who went through the process. Because people need to understand GSB is not just good for entrepreneurship, right? They're also very strong in terms of corporate placement. So maybe can you share a bit more insights about this, how to pivot from aspiring entrepreneur to quickly going back to a more corporate career and how GSB maybe can help for this?
So, I mean, GSB is incredibly powerful at helping you transition from your career to pivot from one industry to the other. What you can do, what many of my classmates did, is they use the GSB years to test different business models. But while they're doing that, they're also recruiting for a fantastic internship, over the summer, maybe at a firm like a McKinsey or like a firm like a Blackstone. And then they basically go to those places full time when they graduate. So a lot of the time you can use GSB to move from, for example, banking to private equity, or from a random field to consulting, and open up this trajectory that, really you can't tap into without the network of the MBA. Now, this is kind of a weird thing, I would say, in the world, but there are many of these companies where it's just almost impossible to get in if you just apply randomly from the street. They really recruit heavily from campuses through these structured pathways, for better or for worse. So there are many roles for which if you just apply, it's almost impossible. But once you're a GSB admit or a Wharton admit or something, suddenly, you'll be able to apply. A lot of this recruiting takes place in the first 6 months of the program also. So it's not like you've even learned the content yet, but they're just confident they know what you're going to learn and what that GSB account, really entails, or that GSB experience really entails. So I would say the career services are ridiculous. You have Google and all these top private equity funds coming to you, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, you name it, they're on campus trying to recruit you. And there's a lot of, you've got a lot of bargaining power because you've got a lot of firms that, are really excited to hire you, especially if you come in with a strong, finance background. There are many doors open to you.
So what I would like to understand is, how did you find that balance? Like, full-time scaler, full-time student, because the way you described it, it's phenomenal, because you were like being able to apply directly your learning. But, that's cool when you do a part-time MBA, right? So like you can really focus. But how did you find that balance between, hey, I'm a full-time entrepreneur and I'm a full-time MBA student? And, basically, like, what advice would you give people who are maybe in the same situation as you, years ago, or who are thinking that they want to start something and then go to business school?
I guess the first thing that I would say is you want to be very careful trying this, because there are significant trade-offs to it. So let me give you an example. My GSB classes took about 15 to 20 hours a week. And so after I spend that time, and, I'm usually spending like 80 hours on Crimson, on a chill week probably, I basically have the situation where I almost couldn't do anything else apart from classes and GSB, which is the choice that I made. So I actually skipped, like, they've got this thing like, foam, or like that, these Vegas trips, or these like MBA tours. And there's a big part of the GSB experience is all of the socializing and networking. My approach was like, I'm going to find interesting people. I've got many years to do it, but I'm just going to like hit my classes and focus on Crimson. And so that was like a substantial trade-off, a substantial sacrifice. And, it was worth it, but, it wouldn't be for everyone, because if you're trying to basically build this network out really actively, that comes at a big cost to the value of the program that you're kind of in. So I would say that was a big trade-off that I made, where I just didn't do any extracurriculars, etc., except for focusing hardcore on Crimson. So I would say in my case, though, it's a bit different, because I already had some reasonable scale, and I had a lot of people to manage and random things going on. But if you're starting a new startup, right, a lot of the time you're in the discovery phase, you're speaking to customers. It's quite adaptable. You probably don't have like that much work initially at the beginning when you're kind of incubating this thing. So you definitely, and there were many folks building startups from like the ground up at GSB while they were going through class and having a balanced life. They were dating, whatever. So it's definitely very possible.
So I want to end this like chat with you, like more like maybe like a controversial take around the MBA potentially as well. I think it's fair like to give the pros and cons. But, like the first question, like it's more, again, it's about you. So like, leadership development is really a core element of any MBA program. Whatever MBA info session you're going to attend, from Harvard to like INSEAD to LBS, they all talk about leadership development and how, they're going to prepare you for future leadership roles. So over the last 10 years, Crimson went from like, a very small startup to like almost like $1 billion kind of a company. Your role must have evolved significantly, from managing 50 people at the start of GSB to like, 1,000 plus now, I believe, Crimson size, right? So how would you say GSB was instrumental in your growth as a leader? Not as a business person, purely on the leadership side of it.
So I think at GSB, there's a lot of dedicated coursework just focused on leadership, leadership labs where you basically have weekly feedback, even actually several times a week, on your leadership style and how you approach this. Then you go through like case study after case study after scenario and all these classes for 2 years, many of which taught by academics and many of which taught by practitioners. And a lot of the time in business schools, the practitioners are sort of like not the most legit business people. But at these top business schools, these people are crazy. It doesn't make any sense for them economically to be here teaching this class, but they do it because they sort of love to share their experience. So I had this guy, like, I think his name is Ryan Smith, who sold Qualtrics for like 10 billion shortly after finishing our class. And, he was sitting there, teaching us about sales management. So GSB and HBS and these schools have an amazing ability to pull in like rock stars. Here's a funny example. Like recently I was watching Keeping Up with the Kardashians, and Kim Kardashian, went to HBS and delivered a lecture there. And, Kim Kardashian, probably opportunity cost of 1 hour for her life is, I'm sure in the, tens of thousands probably at this point. But, she makes this trip to, HBS, and it's worth it for her because it's actually a badge of honor in her career to be a guest lecturer at HBS. And that star power brings in that network. So anyway, you hear from all of these leaders that have built these companies. You sit there and, delusional or not, you believe you too can do this. These people have done it and you can do it too. So that's really powerful because as an entrepreneur, you don't want to be doubting yourself. You want to have confidence. You have what it takes to scale. People around you want to feel like, you back yourself when you're going through these, big bets and big moments. So I think the business school gives you functional like content and leadership. It also shows you a lot of pattern recognition. And it's this focused exposure to so many business leaders quickly. You see different leadership styles and approaches. And they also drill into, many, many mistakes, blow-ups, disasters that nuke companies. And that's really powerful too, because it's probably more powerful to learn from disasters than successes, because a lot of the time successes are a little bit company specific, but there are many disasters which are consistent across many businesses. So there are a couple of different things that I found to be very valuable. I also thought GSB made me, a bit more self-aware, self-reflective about different, weaknesses that I had as a leader, which stuck by me. And many of my classmates who are, 5 to 10 years older than me sort of took me under their wing and gave me lots of good feedback and tips and wisdom, which was really useful and has been invaluable to this day. Not just in terms of kind of business strategy, but actually on a personal level, things that I should be looking out for, et cetera, which has been fantastic. So I would honestly say it's been incredible. Yeah, fantastic. 10 out.
Cool. So at the very start, you mentioned like one of the key drivers for you to go for an MBA was really like to prepare like the long-term growth of Crimson, right? So like you wanted to be adequately prepared for when Crimson would be big, which has been for the last few years. So would you say like the GSB, the MBA at GSB worked for you in a very, just mentioned like 10 out of 10. So I believe it's yes. Like it did the job, right?
Super. I think it was like a stat, like I had this belief, if I don't do it now, it'll be really hard to ever do it. I think that was kind of true because although I've continued to do different studies along the way, GSB had a really intense in-person component. And, it's really hard to just be based there for a long period of time. So I think definitely it was a great time to do it. And I really benefited from having these insights then, as opposed to later on in the journey. And it's really helped me scale up Crimson in the last 5 years since I left GSB. So I would say, it hit the nail square on the head, and it was a fantastic opportunity, which I thought it's really game changing for Crimson.
Excellent.
So much so that I've actually sent multiple Crimson execs and folks to GSB, post my experience to ramp them up as well, because I'm such a believer in this temple of business they've built.
Sure. Don't we have like one or two sitting currently at GSB while managing their own like units and like roles, right? I believe.
That's right. One of our execs, Andrew, is a CBOR scholar, ranked second at the GSB academically, and he's our chief revenue officer, running, a huge portion of our global revenue, from his GSB dorm. He's about to graduate this May. So
very impressive.
We really were excited to see him grow through that role.
Very impressive. So, ROI will give it a 10 out of 10 in your case, and I think it will be the case for many, top MBA graduates. But now, to end this chat, I would like to play a bit of like the devil's advocate role here, right? An MBA would, without scholarships, would offset you like roughly 200,000 USD, right? If you go to business school without any scholarship. And let's say as an aspiring entrepreneur, wouldn't it be like better for me to invest 200,000 in my business rather than invest 200,000 in an hypothetical, potential ROI as an aspiring entrepreneur? What are your thoughts on this?
I think the short answer is it really depends on what kind of business you're trying to build. If you're trying to be like a franchise tycoon at McDonald's, by all means, take your capital, build it up, get going with your franchises. If you want to have like 1,000 Subways, put the first 200K into that, probably fine. I think if you're thinking about a venture capital backed business where, you're going for a huge result and you need to raise a lot of capital and there's like a steep learning curve and, mistakes can be fatal, and you don't have this turnkey business in front of you, then the education is very powerful in this regard. So I would say like it depends on how your ambitions are. If you're kind of executing on a very simple business, you're running like a laundromat or something, maybe you don't need this. But I think a lot of folks come to business school, they're swinging big, they're aiming for big outcomes. And I think, 200,000 in the grand scheme of things, it's like it pays itself back so fast. Like even if you just think about the valuation of a company with and without the MBA degree, the marginal degree would be paid off in multiples from any GSB founder because they've gone through this education and they're sort of battle tested by the system and the admissions process. So I would absolutely have invested 200,000, but actually I would have invested a lot more. I think the value to Crimson has already been in the millions of this degree because, I made a lot of multi-million dollar mistakes before I did GSB. And, when I was sitting in these classes, I was thinking, damn, like if I'd learned this class 3 years ago, would have been great. But I was able to apply those learnings on a go forward basis. And, those battle scars were really important lessons. So I would say where it's not worth it is like if you're trying to go into like the nonprofit sector or you're trying to be an actor or something, not going to work. But if you're trying to go into like finance, consulting, technology, entrepreneurship, it's an extreme moneymaker and you're going to pay this thing back in no time from your career success that you've been able to tap into because of the GSB catalyst.
So I think like that was my last question for the day, Jamie. Right.